Vaccination or termination? We've been hearing about this a lot lately, but do employers actually have the right to demand that their employees be vaccinated? Let's find out from Divisional Director of Industrial Relations and Allied Services at the Ministry of Labor, Gillian Corrodus. I'm Kalila Reynolds, and it's time for another episode of Money Moves, JA, brought to you in partnership with Exim Bank's Business Advisory Service, giving you the tools to grow your business. Hi, Gillian. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, this is a very timely topic. I want to know the answer. I know a lot of people watching have been very curious about this because it's been in the news too about people saying, vaccination or termination. So just let's get right to it. Can an employer demand that their employee be vaccinated?
All right, the question you asked is, can they demand? And I would say they may try to, but they really shouldn't. Because we have to contemplate whether or not the person's option of vaccination is against what is our national law. And the International Labour Organization has tried to answer this very question because it's a global question. It's not just something that is happening here in Jamaica, but what the International Labour Organization has said to its member countries, and Jamaica is certainly one of the member countries, is that a conversation should ensue between both the employer and the worker in relation to whether or not that worker wants to be vaccinated. And in having that kind of conversation, the member countries and by extension entities should be well seized of the requirements under Convention 111, Convention 111, that speaks about discrimination, that there should be no policy that causes inequity in the employment relationship. And we have to come from that perspective. So I do know the concerns that employers have, and I'm sure you want us to discuss a little bit more about that, and also the concerns of workers. And obviously we'll discuss some more about that. But all of this must be balanced in the international interest and also the national interest.
So you haven't given me a straight yes or no answer. You said you should talk to your employees about whether they want to be. So what if your employee says? What if your employee
should
says
not be mandatory? And that is the perspective of the ILO presently.
It should not be mandatory.
Should not be. And here in Jamaica, I don't know it is mandatory. It is an option where the worker and employer can exercise that option. And I should hasten to say, the Ministry of Labor encourages all persons who are willing and ready to be vaccinated to go ahead and be vaccinated, because it certainly offers a higher level of protection.
So what if you have employees who are in customer-facing positions, such as employees, workers in the tourism industry who interact face-to-face with tourists? Isn't it the ethical or moral thing or the responsible thing to require that those employees be vaccinated both for their safety and your customers' safety?
Well, Kalila, that conversation has happened in many industries, including the hotel sector. It has happened in personal care. It's even very robust in terms of discussion amongst the household workers and employers. And I can understand that the responsibility of the employer is to ensure that there's a safe workplace. And the place of work safety is also that joint responsibility of the worker.
And that's a legal responsibility to ensure
it is a legal
there's a
responsibility.
Safe workplace.
And what we have to recognize is that the key thing is that the safety of the nation is paramount, but at the same time we have to look at the legal parameters. So yes, I do know that clients in the personal care sector, clients in the hotels have been demanding this. There are many persons who will call the ministry to say, we would like to employ a household worker, but if that person is not vaccinated, I don't want that person in my employment. There are persons who are calling to say, I have someone in my employment and I am not comfortable with them continuing to work with us. Now, we have to recognize that we can encourage that person. And if that person is not willing to take that personal or exercise that personal option of being vaccinated, then there can be some kind of other option where that person is moved from a front line, for instance, to another less sensitive area by agreement, obviously. And also, there can be a consideration for mutual separation. So we have had questions about whether the employer can terminate the worker if he or she refuses to be vaccinated. And the quick answer is no, it would not be entirely lawful to do so, because that might be construed to be some kind of discrimination. And I did open by saying that Convention 111 of the International Labour Organization's guidance speaks about having non-discriminatory practices within employment.
So then how do you resolve that if you have, let's use the household worker example that you raised. So there is no backline work for that household worker to do. There's the one household worker in the one household, and this helper does not want to get vaccinated. The employer is not comfortable with having an unvaccinated person in the household. How do you resolve that if you can't legally terminate the person?
Well, while the forced termination is not suggested, if it is, and I go back to the suggestion that if it is that this person also is of the opinion that they understand the perspective of their employer and they also wish to be separated and to be paid for their years of service, for instance, that would be considered a mutual separation. And COVID-19 has brought about some unprecedented times, questions that we have never had to grapple with as a globe. And Jamaica is a sovereign state. We will make our determinations, but we have to do it in the international context as well. We have to look at what are the international best practices or quote-unquote guidelines, because COVID-19 is new, there's no best practice per se. But we have to look at the guidelines that are available to us. And we have to ensure that whatever we do does not prejudice our organization. So I do know a lot of employers are thinking about the downtime that COVID-19 has caused. The first workplace cluster in Jamaica started in a labor-intensive industry.
Call center.
The call center. And since then, I believe that the call centers, we call them BPOs, but they're now calling themselves the global services sector. They have had a very responsible approach, ensuring that as many persons as possible who want to be vaccinated can have access to the vaccination. And it leads me to say that we have to consider that if you mandate vaccinations and persons are not able to access the vaccine, it also presents a problem.
Well, that's another issue. Access is definitely an issue.
It is.
But let's go back to the example, because I still need to drill down on this. So you can have a fairly amicable separation or a mutual separation, as you termed it, where the employee says, can't bother, you band down my throat, I'm not comfortable, the employer is not comfortable, and you both decide to go your separate ways. But what if the employee is not that understanding and they want to hold on to their job?
Well, I understand where you're coming from, and we have to look at COVID-19 as part of the family of contagious diseases. And we are not unaccustomed to some of these. We've had Ebola, we've had Chick V, Zik V, and dengue. We have had many others, and we have to determine whether or not it's significant enough to cause the separation from employment because the person is not willing to be vaccinated. What I would suggest is that the options, alternate options, would have to be mandated if the employer believes that the exposure to its clients and other workers is significant. And the other mandatory options would include mask wearing, that at all instances, those persons are required to wear a mask. If they do other than wear the mask, that could lead to disciplinary action because the Disaster Risk Management Act speaks specifically about mask wearing and about the sanitation protocols. So those could lead to termination. But at this present point, we have not in Jamaica made vaccination mandatory, and therefore it is not a breach of legislation if a worker chooses not to exercise the option of vaccination at this point. Because let us get to the facts of it. Persons are fearful, partly because they're unaware of all the facts surrounding vaccination.
And there's a lot of misinformation out there.
There's a lot of misinformation. And I will confess that I have been vaccinated. I'm fully vaccinated. And that's a personal choice because I believe that it protects the staff that I work with, and also it protects my family because I have a job that has a high impact in terms of the numbers of persons that I see on a daily basis. So it's a personal choice, and I have chosen to exercise that option.
So if the government was to at some point make vaccinations mandatory, they'd have to change the law, wouldn't they? They'd have to put that into law, legislation?
So what the ILO has said is that it has to be done in the context of Convention 111, where if a country, being a sovereign state, chooses to have mandatory vaccination, it should be done in the context where there is accommodation and exceptions as required. Accommodation clearly for persons who, for some medical reasons I would expect or so, are unable to accept a vaccination at a particular point, or for religious reasons or whatever other reasons are unable to participate in a vaccination if it is mandatory. So it would be in a context that there are exceptions and accommodation. That is what the convention speaks about.
But if it becomes mandatory on a country level, at that point, would employers have the right to terminate if the employee does not get vaccinated? Or to not hire if they're unvaccinated?
Well, only if it becomes mandatory. And again, we have to look at the pros and cons of that. And the government has to look at its international placement in terms of whether or not it wants to go the route of mandatory vaccination.
You know, speaking to you, Gillian, I get the feeling that this is going to be set some legal precedents, that there are going to be lawsuits filed, possibly on both sides.
I anticipate so.
Yeah.
Because I have come across employers that are adamant that they have a role to protect their employees, and especially the labor-intensive organizations have indicated that they have that role and they would want to exercise that role. And I have also come across worker representatives that are adamant that the international accepted practice is that this is an option and that workers should not be adversely affected by their decision to take the vaccine or not to take the vaccine. And I just want to put on record that there are workers who have also complained to the ministry that they are fully vaccinated and their employer does not believe in vaccination and they feel exposed. So it is both sides of the coin actually, and household workers who have said so.
That's an interesting one. That's reverse. The employer feels exposed to the person who is fully vaccinated.
The worker feels exposed because their employer does not believe in vaccinations and does not want to be vaccinated. So the reverse is happening in terms of workers who have comorbidities and have decided to become vaccinated, but they're working with a big family, and that family is not one for religious reasons or otherwise willing and ready to be vaccinated. So the worker also feels exposed. So the Ministry of Labour has been getting concerns from both workers and employers alike.
Interesting. I'm very interested to see where this goes in the coming months and years. Thank you so much, Gillian.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. And here's a recap of some of Gillian's key points. According to the International Labour Organization, ILO, vaccinations should not be mandatory. Workers who deal with the public face-to-face who are not vaccinated can be moved to another working environment with fewer people. There should be no discrimination against employees based on vaccination status. Employers and employees may come to an agreement for mutual separation. That's it for this episode of Money Moves JA, brought to you in partnership with Exim Bank's Business Advisory Service, giving you the tools to grow your business. Visit their website at eximbankja.com and visit my website, KalilaReynolds.com, for a summary of this episode. You can click the link in the description box below. I'm Kalila Reynolds. Until next time.
Let's get this money.